Okay, so good afternoon. I'm happy to open this session of the department seminar, the last session for this year. And our speaker is Monika Czekanowska Gutman. And she is, Monika is, just a minute, I'll find yeah. Monika Czekanowska Gutman is an assistant professor at the Institute of Art History at the University of Warsaw in Poland. Her research focuses on the 20th century Jewish art and culture in Israel, Europe, and the Americas, and the contribution of Jewish artists to modern art. She has recently published the book Reclaiming Biblical Heroines, Portrayals of Judith, Esther, and Shulamit in early 20th century Jewish art. It was published by Brill in 2022. And currently, together with Dr. Dvorah Schoenfeld and Dr. Amitai Mendelssohn, she is carrying out a research project entitled Cagada as an actual sacrifice in the 20th century Jewish culture, with a grant funded by the National Science Center of Poland. And the title of her lecture today is No Angel in Sight, Images of Isaac in Modern and Contemporary Israeli Art. So, Monika, please. The floor is yours.
Hello, I am honored to deliver this paper as part of the seminar of the art department at Bar-Ilan University. My talk deals with an aspect of biblical story of the binding of Isaac, one of the most fascinating and deeply meaningful subjects in Jewish art. The resonance of the subject in the shadow of the tragic current events is not lost on me. The talk I am presenting today is a part of the research project on which I have been working for the past 2 years together with Dr. Dvorah Schoenfeld from the Loyola University of Chicago, who is a specialist in medieval Jewish exegesis, and Dr. Amitai Mendelssohn, who has probably already joined us or will join us today, who is the senior curator and the head of the Israeli art department at the Israel Museum Jerusalem, whom you probably all know. The research project was founded by the National Science Center of Poland. Our research project is devoted to the little explored idea of the actual or enacted sacrifice of Isaac by Abraham in modern and contemporary Jewish visual culture in Israel and in the diaspora. The reading of the story is opposed to the more familiar near sacrifice known as the binding of Isaac in Genesis 22. The story of the binding of Isaac, known as the near sacrifice by his father Abraham, is one of the most perturbing in the Bible. In the 20th century, Jewish artists plumbed this narrative as a way to express both communal and personal stories of violence, trauma, loss, and death in the remote and recent past. For Jewish artists living in the mandatory Palestine, the tale of sacrifice was a source of inspiration for the aspiration of the return and rebirth of the Jewish people in its historic homeland. Decades after the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, Israeli artists continued to contend with this foundational story, but they would view it with a very different lens. Over the course of Israel's more than 75-year history, the telling of the story of the sacrifice of Isaac in the national narrative underwent a profound transformation. In the work of most of the artists in the pre-state Israel, Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac is presented as tragic but necessary act in order to achieve national redemption and revival. Among Israel's young generation of artists who either came of age or were born after the founding of the state in the aftermath of successive wars were some who chose to portray Isaac as dead and his sacrifice an unnecessary and of no redemptive value. For them, Isaac was a victim of murder, and it was the perpetual cycle of violence and injustice that led to his death. The portrayal of Isaac as dead has its roots in several rabbinic texts, in particular the Lamed tradition, but the visual treatment of Ckedah in this light was entirely new and radical turn in Israeli art. This talk explores the theme of the lament over dead Isaac in artworks made in pre-state mandatory Palestine and after the establishment of the State of Israel, in particular after the First Lebanon War, where the theme became very popular in Israeli art. It will consider works on the theme of the Ckedah by 4 artists. This is Abel Pann, Mordecai Ardon, Moshe Gershuni, and Menashe Kadishman. At the beginning of our research, my colleagues and I asked the following questions. When and under what circumstances did the iconography of dead Isaac develop in Israeli art? And what is the connection of this modern iconography with the rabbinic Lamed tradition? To hopefully provide some answer to this question, we will examine each of the artist's treatment of the Ckedah through a national lens related to political and social tensions in Israeli society, and personal lens where the theme resonated differently for each artist. We will demonstrate that this artist's subversion of the visual trope to focus on the violence of sacrifice, the suffering of Isaac, of his loved one, and ultimately his murder. Using visual and textual analysis, we argue that the works reflect the Lamed tradition, which sees Isaac as dead and does not attach any redemptive purpose to his death. This view effectively makes Isaac simply a murder victim. Absent signs of God's mercy and love, the biblical story became a tale of unmitigated violence. The complex narrative of Genesis 22, known in Hebrew as the Ckedah, the binding of Isaac, inspired the visual treatment of the theme in an array of works that serve Jewish communities in their rituals, as you can see from the 3rd century wall painting in Dura Europos, also through the Hebrew medieval manuscripts, and here are some examples, of course there are many other works, and Tachmishei Kedusha, and finally to this work which was created by Moshe Mizrahi. Jewish images visualize the crucial passages of Genesis 22, chapter 9, verse 14. Similarly, Isaac alive lies on the altar. Next to him stands Abraham holding a knife, and an angel pulls back the hand of Abraham to prevent the slaughter. A ram cut in the nearby thicket stands ready to replace Isaac. Indeed, in the biblical text, it is very clear that Isaac was not harmed during the Ckedah, but only bound. Needless to say that in Jewish tradition, the word Ckedah means binding and is related to the act of preparation for sacrifice. In contrast, to Jewish tradition in Christianity, Genesis 22 is called the sacrifice of Isaac, with emphasis on sacrifice, as this narrative for Christian prefigures the actual sacrifice of God, the Father, of his crucified Son, and serve as the main source for the understanding of the salvation of humanity brought by Jesus. In Jewish art, the Ckedah, one of the oldest myths of Judaism and a pivotal theme in Jewish thought and culture, transmitted the message of the special relationship between God and Jewish people, the divine covenant, as the result of Abraham's unconditional belief and devotion to God. In the covenant, Abraham's son Isaac also inherits God's promise of the land and the blessing to him and his offspring. Despite the happy ending of the Ckedah narrative, there is no mention of Isaac when Abraham returns to his servant in Genesis 22, verse 19. Although there are some conventional ways of explaining this, and as well as less conventional possibilities, this troublesome verse gives rise to exegetical possibility that Isaac was, in some sense, slaughtered. Indeed, in Judaism, there is a post-biblical exegetical tradition according to which Isaac was actually sacrificed on the altar as opposed to the near sacrifice described in the Bible. The exegetical tradition of Isaac's actual sacrifice was popularized in the book The Last Trial by Shalom Spiegel, originally published in Hebrew as מהעקדות העקדה in 1950 and in English translation in 1976. In it, Spiegel analyzes some rabbinic texts that have Abraham killing his son and burning his body on the altar and Isaac raising from the dead. Spiegel's book presents several approaches to the Akedah as an actual sacrifice that emerged over the centuries. And of course, the first is the martyrological tradition that developed in medieval Hebrew chronicles and liturgy and sees Isaac's death as an act of Jewish martyrdom. Kiddush Hashem, Isaac dies for sanctification of God's name. According to Shmuel Shepaklu, who studied Jewish martyrdom and pagan and Christian martyrdom in pagan and Christian words, in the Hebrew chronicles describing the massacres of Jewish communities during the First Crusade in 1096, Abraham and Isaac are invoked as exemplars of Jews who sacrificed their family to avert forced conversion. Stressing the interconnection of myth and reality in the recording of this catastrophe, Shepkaru calls this new Ashkenazic representation of the Akedah an actual sacrifice of Isaac by Abraham. 9 centuries later, the Jews of Europe, murdered by Hitler and his accomplices, were viewed as religious martyrs. It is this idea that is behind Spiegel's book, which he composed in the shadow of the Holocaust, particularly his inclusion of the lament tradition where Isaac is actually sacrificed and dies. Another approach to the Akedah is based on the paradox of Isaac being both dead and alive, and regards Isaac's death as a sign of hope. There are sources telling of Isaac being slaughtered, burned, and afterwards resurrected from his ashes. And finally, there is exegetical tradition of lament over that of Isaac, which sees Isaac's death as pointless without any meaning, but we will explore this later on. Modern and contemporary Jewish artists build upon this tradition of the Akedah in which Isaac is dead. Ziva Amishai Meisels, in her groundbreaking book, Depiction and Interpretation, The Influence of the Holocaust on the Visual Arts, was the first to point out the significance of the depictions of the dead Isaac in Holocaust-related art by European and Israeli Jewish artists such as Pinchas Burstein, Marian, and Mordecai Ardon. She also shows how the tradition of dead and alive Isaac is reflected in the American Jewish artist Leonard Baskin's works created in the aftermath of the Shoah. In her book Glory and Agony, Isaac's Sacrifice and National Narrative, literary critic Yael Feldman explores the theme of the Akedah in modern Hebrew literature. Studying the theme in the context of the history of the creation of the State of Israel over the 20th century, she shows how it underwent a transformation from a story of noble death, self-immolation, in Hebrew, Osher Akedah, to imposed sacrifice. She argues that Isaac's death lost its self-sacrificial character after the First Lebanon War in 1982. At that historical moment, it was no longer perceived as an imposed sacrifice, but as a pointless sacrifice of repetitive words. As yet unremarked in the research is the profound effect of the exegetical lament tradition on Israeli Jewish artists in response to the Israeli Arab Wars. In the context of the lament tradition, there are a few texts of particular importance. However, the emphasis in this text is not on what Isaac's death can do for his descendants, or on how he was brought back from the dead, but rather on the Akedah as a parallel to tragic death from persecution. The first two texts are Gittin 57b and Lamentations Rabbah 150, both of which retell the story of Miriam mentioned by name in Lamentations Rabbah, but not in Gittin, whose 7 sons were all killed in a persecution. At the end of the story, Miriam tells her last son, before he dies, to tell his ancestor Abraham that while Abraham bound one on the altar, she bound 7. Unlike Isaac, Miriam's 7 children all die. They are not resurrected. They don't die at the command of God, but rather at the command of a cruel enemy of the Jewish people. While the story of the Czekanowska is followed by Isaac marrying and producing the next generation of Abraham's family, Miriam's story ends with the death of all her children, followed by her own. Still, Miriam sees them as similar. They are not exactly the same, and the version in the Lamentations Rabbah makes this clearer by having Miriam add that Abraham's Czekanowska was a test while Miriam's was an action. But they are similar enough that Miriam can draw on the Czekanowska as a source for understanding and thinking through her own desperate situation. The other text, which is particularly important for our discussion, is the Lament, as Behaloch Jeremiah, the Jeremiah went, which takes this imagery even further. It was composed by Elazar HaKhalil, a Byzantine Jew living in the 6th century for Tisha B'Av, the day of mourning for the destruction of the temple and of Jerusalem, and for all the tragedies in exile. In this lament, all the patriarchs and matriarchs pled to God to reverse the exile and allow their descendants to return to their ancestral homeland. In the process, they each describe the terrible things they were forced to undergo in the exile. Isaac describes his fate thus: "Have I been butchered in vain that my children are being killed?" In this lament, which was written to be said in the context of mourning many people who were actually killed, Isaac describes himself as having been killed just like his children. Of course, there is a paradox in that in the biblical story, Isaac only married and had children after the near sacrifice. Hence, in this verse, he is both dead and alive, dead that he may be mourned, alive that he could father children who would die like he did. In any case, his death is a cause for a lament and parallel to the death of his descendants. To the best of our knowledge, the first Jewish artist who introduced the notion of Isaac dying was the immigrant Eretz Israeli painter, artist Abel Pann. In one of 46 lithographs of the Bible made in 1923, as well as in the second version, as you can see here, which was pastel version from the mid-1940s, and this version also exists in other variations, Pann offers a startling rendering of the binding of Isaac. Glaringly missing in his interpretation of the scene are the angel that stops Abraham from slaughtering his son, and the ram that will replace Isaac of the sacrificial pile. Moreover, Isaac's bound body is portrayed as lifeless. Whether or not Pann was aware of the exegetical tradition where Isaac was killed, the very idea of the possibility of an enacted sacrifice and the acknowledgement that the sacrificing of sons happens seem to have inspired the chilling and the hopeless tones of his depictions. In this color lithograph, which you can see now on the screen, Pann shows Abraham cradling Isaac's head with his left hand and holding the knife in his right. Isaac's tightly bound body shows no signs of protest. Instead, his relaxed pose suggests a willingness to be sacrificed, as in the Midrashic tradition of offering himself up in sacrifice. Isaac's head, falling back into the fold of Abraham's extended arm, nestled against his father's breast. His face is hidden from view, suggests that the boy is either dying or already dead. Abraham's eyes, register terror and horror, but also remorse after doing the deed, with no one or nothing to stop him. Pann's binding of Isaac unfolds in the local Eretz Israeli landscape. Abraham wears ethnic Yemenite dress and stands against the background of what appears to be acacia tree, a species indigenous to the land of Israel, and which is also mentioned in the Bible. Pann created this work at the time of the violent encounters between Arab and Jews under the British Mandate. In 1990, the first Jewish battalion in the British Army was created, from which would eventually emerge the Jewish paramilitary organization Haganah, whose mission was defending the Jewish residents living in mandatory Palestine prior to the establishment of the State of Israel. Pann interprets Genesis 22 in a new militaristic context, making the story relevant for the times. For him, the dying or dead Isaac embodies a noble death. In other words, for Pann, a noble death is the death of a young Jewish warrior for the motherland, Eretz Israel, and it is inscribed in the martyrological tradition of actual sacrifice. At this point, unlike later in his life, after suffering a very personal tragedy, Pann sees the state as an ideal worthy of dying for, and the death of its youth in defending it as possibly redemptive. Abraham's embrace of Isaac and the body's reclining limp body strongly recall depictions of Jesus lying dead in the arms of Mary, like Pietà or Lamentation, representing the ultimate sacrifice and bereavement of the fallen. As you can see later, Menashe Kadishman would utilize this motif some 60 years later. Pann's version of the Aqdah from the mid-1940s is more terrifying still. In contrast to the color palette of the earlier work, here orange, yellow, and reddish tones heighten the drama. Pann presents a close-up view of the young Isaac and white-haired Abraham, who, as Millie Haid argues, encompass the whole space between heaven and earth, making the two-figure forces of nature. Abraham appears as if communing with dead Isaac or dying Isaac as he presses his face close to Isaac's, whose head he pushes back so that we can see the boy's skeletal face frozen in fur. Here too, he's bending over Isaac and touching his face, recall Mary lamenting over the dead body of Christ, as in Giotto's lamentation of dead Christ. Yet, like in the earlier work, the tightly bound ropes on Isaac's hands ensure that there is no escaping of his fate. In the second version of the Aqdah, there is no sacrifice, only terror and bereavement. Abraham and Isaac's expression register terror and grief. It is a pure representation of lament. It was commonly thought that Pann painted this work after his son Eldad's death. However, Amitai Mendelssohn's recent research has shown that Pann created the second version before Eldad's death in 1948. In the shadow of the Second World War, the 1940s in Palestine saw the rise of Jewish national forces in the ongoing battle against the Arabs and the British Mandate. The War of Independence broke out a day just after the establishment of the State of Israel, when 7 Arab countries attacked the new state. Ruth Carton Bloom notes that during the War of Independence, a large number of plots in Israeli dramas ended with the death of the hero, whose sacrificial action enables society to go on living. Chaim Guri, the most renowned representative of the Palmach generation, wrote Yerusha, Heritage, where though Isaac is not eventually sacrificed, he and his descendants carry an enduring wound. They are born with the knife in their hearts. Glenda Abramson sees in Guri's work the inheritance of the act of brutality as Israel's collective destiny. Eldad Pann had been a fighter in the Palmach, and the elite force of the Haganah, and participated in various combatant operations and missions. He was killed in the Battle of Gush Zion near Jerusalem in May 1948, days before the declaration of the independence of the State of Israel. In the aftermath of his son's death, the sorrow-stricken father swore he will never paint the Ckedah again. Abel Pann's omission of the angel and ram in the Ckedah emphasized the atmosphere of terror, of tragedy, to the point where it is impossible to interpret Isaac in the works as anything but that. Mordecai Ardon also broke, as you can see here, with the traditional visual representation of the binding of Isaac, and he was the first Israeli artist to depict Isaac as unquestionably that. In his Sarah of 1947, he shows the powerful figure of the first matriarch lifting her arms up to her face in a universal gesture of grief as she stands above her son, who lies dead on the ground next to her. Abraham, as you can see, is reduced here to a diminutive figure in the lower left corner of the painting. His present registering little or no importance in the scene. For this departure from the biblical narrative, Ardon draws upon a rabbinic tradition that tells of Sarah being witness to Isaac being put to death, and of her weeping and lamenting in a grief during the act. In Midrash Tanhuma Vayera, having heard from Satan that her beloved son was killed by his father, Sarah not only grieves, but also ultimately dies. Another rabbinic source has the sacrifice Isaac no longer a child, and this is also very important for this kind of iconography, that Isaac is presented as an adult. He was 37 years old when he was offered upon altar. Given the year of this work, as well as the fact of Ardon's own loss of his parents and 7 siblings in Auschwitz, it should be understood, as Ziva Amishai Meislush has pointed out, as one of the artist's several attempts to cope with the Shoah. Here is the perversity of God against which Sarah cries in a horror. Isaac, whose pale body lies on the ground, has his head turned to the side, hands folded on his chest, symbolizes the innocent victims who perished in the concentration camps and ghettos. Sarah's blood-red dress signifies agony and death. In this horrible word, the leather, a sign of Jewish people's covenant with God, lies flat on the ground. Following the lament tradition, the work suggests that there is no redemption and the pointlessness of Isaac's death. Ardon created an unprecedented image of Sarah mourning over dead Isaac in Jewish art. One wonders whether he had particular visual references in mind while creating it. We know that Ardon was born in the small Polish town, Tuchów, where he attended a secondary school led by the Redemptorist Catholic order, and later, during his studies in Tarnów, he was also helped by one of the city's bishops. We assume that Ardon knew extremely well Christian tradition. Writing in 1948 about Ardon's Sarah, Heinz Politzer suggested that he was inspired both by Passion iconography and in particular by Pietà, but also by modern references to the Pietà, as in Picasso's Guernica of 1937. Yet it is also likely that Ardon was inspired by lament scenes in modern Jewish art. In Sarah, he seems referred to Chagall's Abraham weeping over the death of Sarah from the series of gouaches for the Bible, though Ardon must also have known the artist's gouache of the sacrifice of Isaac from the same series. In an interesting reversal, it was Ardon's Sarah of 1947 that might have inspired Chagall's Pieta Rouge of 1956, which visually refers to the binding of Isaac. In Abraham Weeping Over the Death of Sarah, Chagall presents Abraham as a monumental figure covering his wrinkled face with a massive hand in a display of grief. Ardon similarly focuses on the monumental figure of Sarah and her powerful gesture of bereavement. The spots of green in Sarah's dress recall the green of Abraham's clothing, where it symbolizes death. Isaac, like Sarah, is rendered in a strong white tones and lies at Sarah's feet in the foreground. Ardon's painting as a personal reckoning with his grief over the loss of his immediate family in the Holocaust corresponds with the London-born Jewish painter Maurice Kestelman's Lama Sabachthani, Why Have You Forsaken Me, created in 1943 during the Shoah. Kestelman's paintings show a sense of collective mourning of the survivors over the dead. Every figure displays another gesture of grief at the sight of the piles of lifeless bodies, including one woman who displays the same gesture of grief as Ardon's Sarah. After the First Lebanon War, there is a sharp change in the nature of Ckedah imagery. Moshe Gershuni and Menashe Kadishman were among the first artists to visualize this shift. A decade before, Israeli dramatist Hanoch Levin challenged the prevailing interpretation of the Ckedah as noble sacrifice in one of his sketches in his play Malkat HaAmbatya, the Queen of Baftu, staged in the Kameri Theater in 1970 in Tel Aviv. According to Ruth Carlton Bloom, Levin challenged the myth as told in the early Israeli literature and instead viewed the story from the point of view of the dead Isaac. In his rendering, Abraham is emphatically not a hero. His only duty is to ask forgiveness of Isaac. Levin's dramatic reinterpretation of the story transformed Abraham from a saint into a murderer, and Isaac from a martyr into a murder victim. Interestingly, Levin's reading of the Ckedah didn't reverberate in Hebrew literature in the same way the works of Gershuni and Kadishman would in the Israeli art scene. The First Lebanon War began on the 6th of June in 1982 and lasted 3 months. Many Israelis saw this war with its high casualty rate as unnecessary, and it aroused an unprecedented storm of protest that continued for years and ended only some 30 years later when Israel finally withdrew the last of his presence in the region. Among the most silent images of the war were the spontaneous demonstrations of bereaved parents who had lost sons weeks, sometimes only days before. As the battles were happening, parents placed manifestos in the newspapers and updated the number of unnecessary deaths in the conflict daily. In his study of bereavement in Israeli society, Udi Lebel argues that the political model of mourning reasserted itself during and in the aftermath of the war in Lebanon. After the Yom Kippur War, when many thousands of soldiers died in a sort of a period of time, the political model of bereavement, a term Lebel introduced, emerged where bereavement was used by Israelis to publicly expose the military negligence and bad decision that had caused the death of so many soldiers. According to Yael Feldman, this view of the Lebanon War became a turning point in Israel and was reflected in new retellings of the story of the Ckedah. We argue that the visual treatment of the biblical story during that time drew upon the lament tradition of mourning Isaac as a victim of pointless violence and as a plea for an end to the war and bloodshed that had marked the state of Israel's history from its founding up to that point. Art historian and curator Dorette Levitt-Halten views the images of Moshe Gershuni, not just of the Akedah, as expressing the sound of trauma, that is lament, executed as if the images are in a state of panic, of a turmoil, enacting suffering and loss. In our view, however, this statement is particularly relevant for his Akedah works. In many of Gershuni's Akedah paintings created around 1982, Isaac is a symbol of Israeli soldier, modeled in the ethos of New Jew, young, strong, potent, connected to the land and able to defend himself. That was crucial to the Zionist rhetoric in its first stages. As a conceptual artist whose intellectual thinking was shaped in the later stage of Zionist thought, the new Jew for Gershuni was an archetype to be subverted as a part of a post-Zionist viewpoint. His Isaac remains an Israeli soldier set in a military context, often drawn in relation to the national flag, and is thus connected to Israeli identity and the new Jew archetype, but he is not a hero. His Isaac is a victim of a restlessness, wars that have consumed Israeli society. He is ultimately not able to defend himself. Gershuni Isaac is also deeply personal. The artist explained how lucky I was that his name was Isaac, that I could write his name at work in such a way. It's okay to play chess with his name as a symbol of the victim, like the soldier, like Wojciech. But it was also a way to bring out an emotion, the heart of emotion I had for him. Gershuni Isaac is a real person, a victim not only of militarism, but of homophobia. In 1980, Gershuni experienced a breakdown. He left his wife and family and openly declared his homosexuality. At that time, he began a relationship with a young soldier named Isaac. During his recovery from the mental breakdown, he began to paint freely, using his fingers while crouching on all fours. Levitt-Halten views Gershuni's painterly act in producing these images, crouching down and painting on the surface, laid flat on the floor, as akin to the physical expressions and motions that are associated with the act of lament. Gershuni images show his profound knowledge of the Jewish bookshelf and cultural tradition, the Hebrew Bible, rabbinic literature, and Jewish prayer book, as well as Christian literary and cultural sources like the New Testament and Christian iconography. His vast knowledge is on display in his Akedah works, where he adds biblical quotations, such as from the book of Amos, rabbinic questions, where was Isaac? This was the question asked by Rabbi Yohanan in Genesis Rabbah, and repertoire of Jewish Israeli visual symbols, among them flag and cypress tree. Moreover, Gershuni images, similarly to rabbinic interpretation, emphasize the focus, the certainty of Isaac and his suffering, as in Melchita de Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. Gershuni renders this visually through the name Isaac, which appears as the central component in 10 of his works, written in his hand, sometimes neatly and other times more like a scroll or a scribble. In Jewish culture, a name is not only a label identifying an individual, but also may determine the person's character and faith. Gershuni Isaac, in his interpretation, suffered in much the same way the biblical Isaac and rabbinic Isaac did. But his suffering seems not redemptive. Instead, he was bound up with a sexually transgressive love for which there was no happy ending. The Akedah wasn't a sign from God. It was a child sent by paternal figure to suffer, just as the young, beautiful lover Isaac was sent to war and exposed to violence and death. Luckily, Gershuni's young lover wasn't killed in the battle and remained with the artist as his partner until the mid-1990s. Yet, as Ori Destal notes, for the artist, the name Isaac functions as a metonym of an unprevented sacrifice. Let us look more closely at some of Gershuni images and explore their development from ones that include some signs of hope or refer to those where the hope seems completely lost. In the work you can see now on the screen, Isaac from 1982, the artist writes the Hebrew name Yitzchak in a large, uneven, cursive Hebrew script atop the image of a flag. In the right corner below the flag are blood light smudges. In the intertwining of blood and letters of the name Isaac, Gershuni references the rabbinic tradition of the blood of the Aqdah of Isaac, as for example in the Midrash Mekilta di Rabbi Ishmael on Exodus. And this is the quotation. And when I see the blood of the Aqdah of Isaac. And it is said, and Abraham called the name of the place the Lord will see him. And later on it says, and as he, the angel, was about to destroy Jerusalem, the Lord saw and repented of the evil. What did he see? The blood of Isaac's Aqdah. According to the exegetical text, God sees the spilling of Isaac's blood, which then prevented the destruction of Jerusalem. Gershuni inverts the exegetical image. There is no God, and the destruction is not thwarted. In Gershuni's story of the Aqdah, Isaac dies for his land in a world in which angels and God are not present. The blood-stained tale of the agony and death of the fallen soldier, whose sacrifice, like the one of the biblical Isaac, must never be forgotten. But for Gershuni, apart from the obvious connotation of the color red with the blood, which connotes both the victim and the dead, the color itself in Gershuni's words also the reason for the image to speak, to open dialogue. It means to shock, to awaken the viewer to talk about what is actually happening. Inscribed on the flag is the passage from Amos, chapter 9, verse 11. In that day I will rise up the tabernacle of David that is fallen, which suggests not only the young soldiers fighting and dying in Israel's wars, but also hope of restoration. The note of hope may reflect an early stage in the war, and there is a less hope in some of his later works. It may also express, as the artist himself says, the natural human desire to overcome death and finality. In 1982, against the background of the First Lebanon War, Gershuni made several works bearing the title Yitzhak, Yitzhak, which were exhibited the same year at Givon Art Gallery in Tel Aviv. In one in particular, Gershuni reuses much of the same iconography. In this newer work, featuring a yellow background, the artist crops the image of the flag and divides the quotation from Amos over 2 lines. While the text in cursive Hebrew in black paint, he singles one word in each line in red. Akim I will raise up, and Nofelet that is fallen. Even though the whole passage suggests hope for restoration of the David's tabernacle, the opposite meaning of the 2 words in red and the placement of the quotation against the muddled red and yellow background informs about the bloodshed in the name of the state, and perhaps also about the absurdity of the objectives of the current war. Red and yellow became dominant colors in several of Gershuni's paintings at that time, with the red denoting blood and the yellow signifying urine and other bodily and poisonous fluids, suggesting the rot and the decay of decomposing bodies. We have seen this particular color combination before in Pann's Aqdah from the 1940s. While we do not know if Gershuni, who was also deeply schooled in Israeli art, had Pann's work in mind, it is interesting to note the effect of these colors in both artists' works as having symbolic meaning and creating an atmosphere of impending destruction and death. The biblical phrase of Cedar of Lebanon in the bottom right corner is just opposed with the name Isaac that appears twice, followed by the exclamation point in the upper left corner. The Cedar, of course, carries various connotation. It refers to the temple and altar of the sanctuary. It is also the national symbol of the country Israel is at war. as it appears on its flag. However, we propose to interpret this phrase in the context of Gershuni homoeroticism, and he seems to use it as a metaphor for the righteous, as in the Psalm 92, the righteous shall flourish like the palm tree, he shall grow like a cedar in Lebanon, and perhaps he's here also referring to his lover, the Israeli soldier, Isaac's beauty, power, and strength. In another work from that year, only the name Isaac appears on the flag, written twice, Yitzhak, once horizontally and once vertically, with each iteration followed by an exclamation mark. And in the middle, you can see black cypress tree, which appears in between the two names. The cypress tree was an early symbol in Zionist iconography, popularized in Bezalel School of Arts and Crafts. When Theodor Herzl, father of modern political Zionism, visited Palestine in 1898, he planted a cypress sapling in the village of Moza. After Herzl's unexpected death in 1904, the tree became a pilgrimage site for the Zionist youth, who also planted cypress trees in the surrounding area. So the cypress tree becomes to signify the connection to the land of Israel and the hope of a future state. In this particular work, it appears to struggle. In Gershuni's works, it appears to struggle as it bends precariously, as if in danger of toppling. Rendered thus, the tree may be an allusion to the fact that the struggle and death are perpetual in the earth in which it grows. Here too, the yellow and reddish background behind the unstable cypress may carry symbolic meaning, evoking the ideas of destruction and death. Igal Zalmona interprets this particular tree as a personal statement as Gershuni personal statement, alluding to the famous painting by Van Gogh, Cypresses, of 1889, and the spirit of some of his earlier works on which he wrote, Gershuni, I am Vincent. In this version of Isaac, Gershuni connects between Isaac, who is a soldier and a victim, and Van Gogh and the excluded artist. Like the biblical Ckedah, Gershuni's is the sacrifice of beloved person, of beloved son. Like the biblical Ckedah is like the biblical Ckedah, Gershuni is the sacrifice of a beloved person, with the difference that in the Bible it was the father who sacrifices his beloved son, whereas in Gershuni it is he, the artist himself, sacrificing his lover. The Ckedah is now also a personal story of victimhood, his own sacrifice related to his homosexuality, and a mixture of desire, rage, and also lament. In the work titled Isaac, with great pity I have loved you, from 1982, Gershuni develops the dead Isaac iconography by adding what appear to be two blooded wings of a bird, one bigger, one smaller, below the flag. The name Isaac appears twice on the flag, corresponding to the wings, one time written in strong red paint and the other in fading letters, signifying perhaps Isaac's disappearance. In this image, Gershuni calls out to his lover in the middle of death and destruction, intertwining grief and love with his keening cry. In another work from 1982, titled Little Isaac, Where Are You Going to? Yitzhak HaKatan, Le'an Ata Holech, the image of a black lily at right and the branched system of lines in a flower-like shape dominate the question. Yitzhak HaKatan, Le'an Ata Holech, written in a small Hebrew cursive. Little Isaac, where are you going to? In this seemingly indirect way, Gershuni is in fact asking the fundamental question posed by rabbinic sages about Abraham's return from the Mount Moriah in Genesis 22, verse 19, where was Isaac? Where is Isaac? The artist's answer leaves no doubt. Black lines in the right corner and the center, and the black flower at the left evoke notions of torment and destruction. Here, Isaac becomes a black flower, symbolizing lost life, lost innocence. With the words little Isaac, Gershuni reveals his parental love for a lost son. Here, the different symbolic meaning of Isaac are united. The image of a flower symbolizes romantic love, but a black flower symbolizes grief, and the phrase little Isaac evokes a grief of a child. The last work by Gershuni I would like to consider today, titled My Little Isaac, from 1983, is from the series of 8 works devoted to 4 main themes: Judaism, Israeliness, homosexuality, and cyclamen. In the poem Bab el-Vad, an elegy for soldiers killed in the 1948 Independence War, Haim Guri linked the dead soldier forced into sacrificial role of an eternal Isaac with the cyclamen that grows on the spot where they fell in the battle. The flower is still associated in Israel with vulnerability and the death of young soldiers. In Gershuni's paintings after 1983, the cyclamen became the central motif, appearing like human limbs, sexualized buttocks, and reflecting various human states. As Alec Mishori remarks, Gershuni's cyclamens are crude and look like monumental fleshy growths. Their flowering or wilting may be interpreted as the projection of artist's emotional state, with the cyclamen serving as his self-personification. But we should also look at the swastikas, which are here. 2 swastikas float above the red cyclamen in My Little Isaac. The swastika motif features in many of Gershuni's works in 1980s, where it is a direct reference to the Holocaust and the agony of the murdered Jews during the Shoah. Here, it remains not only of the Jews that perished in the Shoah, but also of dead Israeli soldiers currently being sacrificed in the battlefield. In the wake of the First Lebanon War, the artist Menashe Kadishman, of the same generation as Gershuni, became preoccupied as well with the Akedah. While the impulse to deal with this subject was also deeply personal, it was associated for him with being the parent of a son who was drafted into the army at the start of the war. Kadishman's son, Ben, didn't die during his army service, but the artist Cagall works reflect apparent fears and feeling of helplessness in the face of the horrible prospect of the death of a child in the battle. Kadishman ponders on this. My son didn't die, but I am talking about attitude. You know, the attitude becomes form. The main thing, if you think philosophically, is that nobody asked Isaac what he wants. I would say at least him speak, because that's what Isaac wants. Kadishman's interest in the Akedah developed alongside his preoccupation with the theme of human-animal sacrifice, which traces back in his works to the 1961 and more precisely to the 1978 and to his ship project for the 1978 Venice Biennale. And perhaps further to 1973 when Kadishman and his son served as models for the figures of Abraham and Isaac in the American Jewish artist George Segal's sculpture, Sacrifice of Isaac. Kadishman's intense period of engaging with the theme of Akedah in the 1980s, in response to the First Lebanon War, resulted in diverse types of the scenes in a variety of media. Some share a particular iconography the artist developed that portrays, and here you can see this particular type of an iconography and its variation, which portrays the ram as triumphant over the dead Isaac, starting with the work The Ram is Triumphant in 1983. But there is another iteration, which is also interesting, has the ram and Isaac becoming or forming a kind of a hybrid image, and you can see how Kadishman work and make it diverse over a certain period of time. Each of his treatments of the Akeda is worthy of its own deep exploration, but because our time is limited, I would like to focus today on only two of his Akeda works. And the first is the painting you can see from 1984, in which the artist presents a family portrait with the dead Isaac. This is an intimate bereavement scene where the medium of oil on canvas is powerful, exploit, and the tonal qualities of blue and yellow and red are used to explore the emotional responses of the parental grief and bereavement. As you can see at the upper right, there is Sarah and Abraham. They pale gaze toward the center of the painting to the figure of a dead child, clothed in a black shroud. And this is, of course, dead Isaac, his face a skull with tar-like black eyes, nose, and mouth. In imagining Isaac as a generic skeletal corpse, Kadishman makes him a symbol of the innocent young soldiers who die not as martyrs, but as the child victims of the state-sponsored murder. In this work, Kadishman viscerally visualizes and criticizes the national trauma of young Israelis being sent to their deaths. Looking again at Isaac, however, we will notice that he is surrounded by an aureole of white and a rainbow of molted colors that seems to emerge from the bouquet of flowers in the jar, resting on the table at the lower left. The flowers are, of course, a modern sign of memorializing the dead. Kadishman's reference to the Christian symbol of the aureole and rainbow is here intended to distinguish Isaac's unnecessary death as something that deserves to be mourned and commemorated. Missing in the Akeda story are the angel of the Lord and the ram. Instead, the diagonal flow of this painting from upper right to the lower left ends with the image of donkey, who, as we know, was left at the bottom of Mount Moriah with the servants, where Abraham continued alone up to the mountain with Isaac. The donkey's head is lowered as if it is communing with the dead Isaac, whose skull head is turned in its direction. The donkey has a particular resonance for Kadishman, who sees it as a humble, patient, and brave beast, saddled with the suffering and sacrifices of the modern man, and here appears as a silent witness to this man-made atrocity. While both parents look on helplessly at the dead child, Kadishman draws attention to Sarah by surrounding her with a blood-red halo. Her prominence in this work reminds of Ardon's Sarah of 1948, and like Ardon, Kadishman shows his knowledge of Midrashic tradition by including her in the Akeda story. Kadishman emphasizes the impact of the deaths of Israel's innocent youth in war on those closest to them, and that these deaths are not a sacrifice, not commanded by God. Kadishman's most important work on Sacrifice of Isaac from 1982 to 1985, a large-scale iron sculpture created as a direct response to the Lebanon War, installed at the northeastern corner of the entrance to the Tel Aviv Museum of Art, immediately became a canonic work of Israeli art. Kadishman dispenses with the figures of Abraham and the angel and instead portrays Isaac in relation to the ram. He also introduces mourning figures whose presence evoke bereavement. Isaac's embodied as a disc-like head, positioned flat on the ground, lies beneath an upright, menacing ram's head. In this retelling of Genesis 22, the ram, rather than replacing Isaac as the sacrificial offering, is an empowered, dominant, and frightening force. In a subversion of its role, the ram, whose horizontally splayed horns recall the shape of the cross, oversees the sacrifice of the son lying dead on the ground. Kadishman heightens the cruelty of the sacrifice by reducing the child Isaac to a decapitated head. Isaac's face with parted lips foreshadows the later work Shalechet, Fallen Leaves, in Jewish Museum in Berlin, featuring thousands of similar iron blank looking faces with mouths open in a mute scream. Kadishman Isaac, as you can see, is a silent, passive, innocent, dead victim. Lying as if discarded on the ground, the image recalls the words of Israeli poet Eli Alon following the Six-Day War about the meaninglessness of the death of Isaac. Isaac's life is not important in itself. It has no value. In Kadishman's work, Isaac is a victim of the pointless military decision that was the First Lebanon War. To Isaac's cry, the purring of mourning mothers watch from the sidelines. They are Israeli mothers who, during the war, reminded the country daily of the horrors of this sacrifice, as if plucked from the scenes of lamentations over the dead Christ. And here is one of the examples, but you can find many other which really are very similar to this one. And these mothers stand witness to the actual sacrifice of their sons. Kadishman explains the Aqdah also as resonating beyond the Lebanon War. He says, the sacrifice of Isaac is not an abstract symbol for me. It is a part and parcel of my own biography and that of my generation. And it may be biography of my children after me. The artist speaks about perpetual mourning over the country's youth and his sublimation of passion iconography. So here we have mourning mothers, but we also have ram's horn in the shape of a cross. And this reflects his anger at the Jewish state that sends its sons to war in a ritual of endless sacrifice. In this sense, even the iron from which the sculpture is made is meaningful. In Avodah Zarah 16b and Genesis Rabbah 5, iron is associated with war. Both of these rabbinic passages place iron at the center of stories of destruction, in which even the victim is complicit. In his discussion of Kadishman's sacrifice of Isaac, Israeli art curator Amnon Barzel interprets the meaning of the iron in relation to the land of Israel. He says, the land of Israel, whose mountains are of iron and its earth of lead. The reality has turned the prophecy into a hell of battles, and the land whose mountains are loaded with the bullets and its earth with the iron wasted weapons. According to this interpretation, the sculpture's very material reflects the violence that is physically part of a land. Given these terms, Kadishman's Aqdah is the opposite of redemptive and religious. It is a murder, just as the land is the source of unceasing and senseless death in war. Spanning most of the 20th century, Israeli artists Abel Pann, Mordecai Ardon, Moshe Gershuni, Menashe Kadishman, reread the story of the Ckedah to show Isaac as a murder victim for whom there was no divine intervention to stop his death. Responding to the collective tragedies of their time, they drew on the lament tradition of Jewish culture, which included the idea that Isaac was dead and mourned, paradoxically by his descendants. On one level, the artists engage with the universal experience of grief and mourning. On the second level, they experience their own personal grief and fear over the loss of family and loved ones, who are also critiquing the notion of national sacrifice. The meaning of Isaac's death in the work of this artist changed over time. Abel Pann's portrayal of Abraham's shock at Isaac's death in his rendering of the binding of Isaac created in pre-state Yishuv in mandatory Palestine is presented as tragic but necessary act in order to achieve national redemption and revival. Pann's works may be considered the precursor of the representation of dead Isaac in modern Israeli art. Mordecai Ardon's figure of dead Isaac lying on the altar, created in response to the Shoah just before the establishment of the State of Israel, is the first attempt to introduce this new iconography in modern Israeli as well as Jewish art. Gershuni and Kadishman's images utilize various rabbinic textual references as well as visual symbols developed through artistic choices, showing suffering, wounded, and finally dead Isaac. Their works tell about trauma, victimization, and above all, bereavement in Israeli society following the First Lebanon War. Ruth Carlton Bloom, writing about Kadishman Ckedah works in particular, views them with the modern secular experience of never-ending sacrifice as pitted against the Jewish paradigm in which sacrifice brings redemption and salvation. As we have seen, this sentiment can be also applied to Gershuni's Isaac's paintings. The story of Isaac is embedded in the history of modern state of Israel and returns again and again in Israeli art in a narrative that argues that it is good for the individual to die for the sake of the nation. Art in which Isaac is depicted as dead and murdered thus functions as a counter-narrative in which death, particularly in war, is not called by God. But if the death doesn't bring redemption or salvation, what alternative ways exist to find hope? I offer in conclusion some thoughts on a recent work that builds on Kadishman's iconic sculpture, The Sacrifice of Isaac, as a visceral and immediate response to the shocking events of October 7, 2023. Kadishman's installation at the Tel Aviv Museum took on a new meaning in light of the horrific tragedy in which parents saw their children killed in front of their eyes. Kadishman's sculpture became part of a new installation on the site remained Hostages Square in the wake of the October 7 atrocities. Created by artist Karen Zach and Tom Love and designer Elad Kalai, and sponsored by the Hostages and Missing Families Forum, the work titled Pieces of Light has reflecting mirrors surrounding the face of the dead Isaac on the ground. The mirrors placed between Isaac and the imposing ram reflects both the faces of visitors and the sunlight. This new addition places the viewer in the role of the murdered Isaac, and by extension of the dead and captured victims of October 7. The text next to the installation explains the reflected faces. Anyone have been a hostage. At the same time, the light and the faces of those who are alive and are reflected in the mirrors are symbols of hope. Isaac is dead and he will not be brought back to life. There is nothing redemptive in his death, in this catastrophe. At the same time, those who are alive still live, and in their life and in the light, there is a hope. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Monika, for this wonderful lecture. And not easy in these days. And now we open the floor for questions, remarks.
Hi, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, first of all, thank you very much. It was really interesting. And it's interesting for me because I'm trying to research about angels and part of it in the Czekanowska Ytzchak. So it was very interesting to see how the angel disappears completely and all that is left is text. And so it was very interesting to see in this position. I wanted to note two things that I've noticed, regarding two of the painting you showed. The first one is Mordecai Ardon. I think maybe, I'm not sure if it's correct or not, but how I read it, maybe the leather in the back represent the angel, because maybe it's a reference to the the dream of a jail. So maybe it's some kind of a representation of the angel. And I think in Kadishman as well, what you mentioned that was Isaac himself, I think maybe it was the angel of death. And it's another representation for the angel, that this time he doesn't stop Abraham from killing his son, but he's there to do the deed. So for me, it was interesting to read it maybe differently.
Thank you.
And the other thing, I think,
that's
and
really
the other thing, I think it will be interesting to see if this period of time that we're in and during the war, we will see more painting like this. Maybe this representation will come back. So I think your lecture is super relevant to this period of time.
This is what I told to Tzvi, that when we thought about this topic, we thought, that it was a history which is much more related to the past, to the previous, and suddenly it became very relevant. But this is also very tragic about this topic. This has such a power, like the myth or the biblical story joins the reality. It's something frightening as well, I would say. But thank you very much for this.
If you allow me to ask another small question. Sorry for taking everyone's time, but you mentioned someone who wrote about these images in medieval times, so I'll appreciate if you just mention the name of the researcher, because I'm interested.
Of course, I think that Professor Shalom Sabar is with us today, so he's definitely an expert.
Right.
And of course, there was Professor Gutman as well. But to the best of my knowledge, all the images I found, actually, Isaac is not that there. Maybe there are some references, but but the whole cultural and textual framing actually leads us to the fact of the persecutions and of that, that people,
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this remark. It was, I have to look again and think about it. Yes.
Thank you.
Any more questions, comments? Seems not. Okay, so if so, as I said in the beginning of the session, this is the last lecture this year in the department seminar. So I want to thank everyone who contributed to the seminar, everyone who attended the meetings, and of course, the lecturers. We had wonderful lectures, and I hope to see everyone next year, hopefully in better times. Okay. So thank you.
Toda rabba.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.